So today is our last day in Jesus' Beatitudes, and yesterday this space was filled with church leaders from all over our islands as we gathered with our brothers and sisters to be inspired and reminded why we're a church, as well as to learn some skills. And one of my favorite things about church leader events is gathering with other ministers and other congregation members from around our islands to hear about what they do in their churches. Also, it's fun to catch up with those of friends that live on our islands that we sit and we laugh and talk story about the fun things that we do at our churches, and sometimes some of you and the fun things that you do, if we're honest. But one of the beauties is that this campus, you all facilitate an opportunity like that all the time at this campus, because you all are so generous of spirit and of resource that we can bless other churches and other communities as they come and gather here and then go home today to their churches to be blessed as well. And so one of the joys of doing this, especially in light of a soft, easy topic like persecution, is that it's good to be reminded that it's not always so bad in the world, even though it can be bad. And to start off today, I thought we'd start off with some church bloopers. These are actual things that were in bulletins of churches that should not have made it past the editing group, but did. And so here's the first one. The sermon this morning, Jesus walks on the water. The sermon tonight, searching for Jesus. Oh, they get better, don't worry. Another one from a different church. Ladies, don't forget the rummage sale. It's a chance to get rid of those things not worth keeping around the house. Bring your husbands. It's not very nice. This one was actually from a church sign. Have you ever driven like churches that change the moniker of what it says, and they're always some kind of like trite saying? This one was quite simple. Don't let worry kill you off. Let the church help. If you are a parent, this will be your favorite of the day. A bean supper will be held on Tuesday evening in the church hall. Music will follow. You know, that one was 0 for 3 on the services. I thought for sure that would be like the one that everyone laughed at, but it was kind of like, maybe it's too immature. I guess I have young enough kids that I still find it hysterical. And the last one. The associate minister unveiled the church's new campaign slogan last Sunday. I upped my pledge. Up yours. Wow. That was a good one. And so it's good to be reminded that we can laugh and enjoy being in church and read bloopers of things that we do. And I also realize that we're at Central Union Church. We've never made a mistake in any bulletin ever. Amen? That's right. But the reality of our life is that we are pretty fortunate to live here. Would you agree? And we're fortunate to live in the United States of America. So out of these 8 Beatitudes, this is the one that's the hardest for me to preach on and talk about. Because the idea of persecution, for me living in the United States of America, first world country, incredibly privileged, that we can walk into worship, not worry at all about what might happen to us, is this idea of persecution in our culture is just not that big of a deal. The worst persecution I've experienced since I've lived in Hawaii was one day when I was out surfing, and someone said, hey, what do you do for a living? And I said, well, I'm a what? I'm a pastor. And literally they looked at me, laid down, and paddled away. I mean, my ego was just crushed. But I mean, really, is that persecution because someone doesn't want to be around me because I'm a minister or because I'm a Christian? The idea of persecution, this phrase I heard all this year at Christmas, there's a war on Christmas. What? We spent billions of dollars celebrating Christmas. And to me, the craziness of our culture is that we live in a predominantly Christian culture in which the vast majority of Americans associate their religious beliefs with Christianity. It's really hard for us to be persecuted when we're the dominant culture of our community. And so what did Jesus have in mind by writing, "Blessed are those of you that are persecuted, for yours is the kingdom of heaven"? Did he have this in mind, of the persecution that we speak of? Or did he have something deeper and broader in mind? And so today, my hope is that we can dive into this ideal and understand, what does this mean? Jesus lived and died about 33 AD. And that time and place, they assumed that the local community assumed that Christians were just a part of the Jewish synagogue. It's a new sect of Judaism. And so for the first 33 years of the church, they dwelled within synagogues and worshiped in the Jewish places. Most people didn't know the differentiation. Certainly the Romans didn't, because the Jewish population was such a minuscule population of the Roman world. And so most of them didn't even worry about what they were doing, because it didn't matter. They were so small and insignificant. But in 66 AD, there was a great fire in Rome that burned down half of Rome. It's believed that Nero, the emperor, blamed it on the Christians because he thought these Christians were kind of weird, because they kept gathering and having love feasts. And as they are having love feasts, they would take bread and talk about eating Jesus and taking wine and drinking his blood. They thought they were cannibals. And so it was easy to blame this weird new sect for the fire, and suddenly mass persecution broke out. Fast forward about 20 years, and Matthew writes his gospel. As Matthew's writing his gospel and talking about the main lessons of Jesus, the church is under mass persecution. And he writes the 8th beatitude. Blessed are you who are persecuted, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. They weren't worried about a war on Christmas. They weren't worried if someone might look at them kind of funny because they go to church. They were literally worried for their very lives. And so in each community, as the churches began and were kicked out of the synagogues, they went into homes. And they had a symbol that symbolized Christianity. Anyone know what it was? The fish. It's called an ichthus. And the ichthus would be on a door, and that was a symbol that it was safe to worship there. And that's how the church began, meeting outside of the synagogue. And one of the challenges that they had is, what does it mean for us to be Christian when it actually costs me something? It could cost me my home, my life. It could cost me my family, the reputation that we have in an honor and shame culture. It could cost me everything. And so why in the world would anyone choose to follow this way? Christianity in America, for me, oftentimes is more of a nominal Christianity. It's this cultural thing that we do, and we're born into it. We have this notion that we're a Christian country, whatever in the world that means. But most often when people say that, it means that we're moral or good. But does that really mean what it means to follow the way of Jesus Christ? To be moral and to be good? Or is it something deeper? And so in this book, The Good and Beautiful Community, this author went on about 5 years ago a quest to understand what was happening in the early church as it was persecuted, and why in the world did it not get killed out and kept growing. In this exploration that he went on, he found an ancient document called the Epistle to Dionysius that was written sometime between 120 and 200 AD. Don't know exactly when, but it talks about what was the difference because the Christian community that was founded in each community. And this is what the document said. The difference between Christians and the rest of mankind is not a matter of nationality or of language or of customs. Christians do not live in separate cities of their own, speak any special dialect, nor practice any eccentric way of life. They pass their lives in whatever township, Greek or foreign, each man's lot has determined. And they conform to ordinary local usage in their clothing and in their diets and in their habits. Nevertheless, the organization of their community does exhibit some features that are remarkable and even surprising. For instance, though they are residents at home in their own countries, their behavior there is more like transience. Though destiny has placed them here in the flesh, they do not live after the flesh. Their days are passed on earth, but their citizenship is above in the heavens. They obey the prescribed laws, but in their own private lives, they transcend the laws. They show love to all people. All men persecute them. They are misunderstood and condemned, yet by suffering death, they are quickened into life. They are poor, yet making many rich, lacking all things, yet having all things in abundance. They repay curses with blessings, and abuse with courtesy. For they do good, but they suffer stripes as evildoers. Do you hear what's happening in the ancient world? There's a marked difference between the way that they live and the rest of the world. Most notably, the way they interact with the issues of their time and the people that may treat them differently. Interestingly, in this ancient world, they were a sect that were known by the way that they engaged others and didn't find ways to isolate or protect themselves from harm, but instead lived into the community that they dwelled as God's holy people in order to show the way of God in their time and their space. It's interesting to me that we live in such a time where Christianity we can talk about pretty much as freely as we ever want to. We live in a time where this morning, as I woke up at 4:40, I wasn't worried about whether someone was going to barge into one of our sanctuaries and hurt us. We live in a time and space where I wonder, what does Christianity mean for us when our world has become so divided and most of that which infuses our belief system is not gospel, but instead news channels? Our church is divided between the liberals and Democrats. I know that. I'm not an idiot. In this church, we have some radical liberals and some radical conservatives and everyone in between. And the goal that we have isn't to say that all you liberals are liberal and all you conservatives are conservative, or that one group is right and another group is wrong. What I hope that we can infuse into this church is that we as a people follow gospel. And that whether you watch Fox News or you watch CNN, those don't speak God's truth. Can I rephrase that? The news is not God's truth. And what I found about humanity, especially this era of us, is that our beliefs and our ways are far more fashioned by these extremes than they are by our gospel. Too often, the conservatives only pick certain parts of the gospel and ignore the social implications of the gospel in actual community. And the problem with the liberals, in my opinion, is that too often the liberals forget that faith is the heart of what we do, and that God does call us to live a certain way that's different than the way of the world. And the problem is that we don't speak with each other, we speak at each other. And we lose the actual meaning of what it means to be us. I believe if we would turn the news off and the internet off and we would spend time in the gospel, we would be disturbed by the actual call of Jesus Christ. That never calls us into isolation or protectionism, never calls us to treat another as enemy or evil, but instead welcomes the foreigner, the enemy, the other into the table as a brother and a sister. And so last century, or 2 centuries ago now, theologian and philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote this about the real truth about Christianity. When one preaches Christianity in such a way that the echoes answer, "Away with that person. He does not deserve to live," know that this is the Christianity of the New Testament. Capital punishment is the penalty for preaching Christianity as it actually is. Why? Because when we take Christianity and the nature of Christianity, it is incredibly political. Did you know that? Jesus is killed not because he's talking about being a Jew, but because Rome can't have him, because he's speaking out against Rome. And so Rome kills Jesus, not the Jews. Everybody get that? Who killed Jesus? The Romans. We painted it that Jews killed him. Jews took him to trial. Romans killed him. And the problem with this idea that Jesus isn't political and when we come to church we shouldn't talk about politics is that faith is something that infuses every part of our lives. The way we look at another, the way that we believe this world to be, the reason why God has implanted humanity on this earth. And it always has political implications. And the depth of this is that most churches aim at individualistic evil. don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, and you're a good Christian. And we actually miss the call of Christ. The call of Christ is to address the systematic evils of our world. The oppression that happens, whether that's in a church or in our communities. And to shine the gospel light into the darkness and say there's a better way for us to be together. The gospel in its essence ought to be unifying, but in reality, oftentimes it creates division. Because often we don't want to change our own ways. I know I don't. And to be challenged by the way of Jesus means that maybe I'm not doing everything I ought. And maybe I need to look at people with a different lens than the lens that I've had. And maybe it's not about protecting myself, but instead opening myself to another. And if truth be told, I don't know that Christianity was ever supposed to be a state religion. I think Christianity was always supposed to be something that was underground, that infused people with this radical ideal of love of one another and love of God, in such a way that it would drive us into communities to love and to bless, even when we were treated badly and persecuted. How many of you want to sign up for that kind of faith? Today in our world, people have already worshiped and gone to bed. And some of those people have worshiped in places that they're choosing to go into worship as life and death. That they may be facing the reality that if they go to worship, their families will disown them. That they may lose their homes or their job. That there's a deep cost to this Christian thing. Last century, there was a theologian and pastor in Germany by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship. And what happened was, as the rise of the Nazis came, Bonhoeffer was one of the few ministers that stood up against the Nazis, and specifically against Hitler. And so what did Hitler do? Put him in jail. And from jail, Bonhoeffer continued to write letters from jail, critiquing what the Nazis were doing and how this was not the way of Christ. And guess what most of the ministers in Germany at the time were doing? They were either dead silent or they were wed to the power system of their day, that they had to support this crazy lunatic. And right before the resurgence came and freedom came, Hitler's one of his last acts was the killing of Bonhoeffer, so that Bonhoeffer could never be freed, because he was so against what Bonhoeffer was doing, and believed that Bonhoeffer helped lead a resurgence underground against the Nazis. In this book of The Cost of Discipleship, he talks about grace. And grace is either really cheap or really expensive. It either costs you nothing or it costs you everything. And grace that costs you nothing never changes anything. It doesn't change you. It doesn't change our world. It's just ideology. But costly grace cost me something. And it cost me something because it cost God something. Because God was willing to go the nth degree to show us how to love. And so as we talk about blessed are the persecuted, for theirs is the kingdom of God. What are the takeaways that we get? Number one, people all over the world are persecuted in this moment. We are fortunate and we are blessed and we are privileged as a people. We live in the first world. Our concerns that we deal with here pale in comparison to the actual concerns of clean water, enough food to drink, diseases that people get from mosquitoes that are completely preventable. Our problems, if we really take a step back and look at our lives, are really not that bad. They may be bad for us, but to the rest of the world, they're like, really? Really, my kid is dying because he has constant diarrhea. And you're worried about whether or not your iPad is charged? That this is the kind of world that we live in, that our reality isn't everyone's reality. And so how do we bless our world with our immense abundance that we have in America? Interesting fact, how much do you think was spent on Valentine's Day in America alone? Throw out numbers. $1 billion? $18 billion on Valentine's Day. We are a privileged people. What could we do with $18 billion in this world? We figured out in our family, cards are so stinking expensive. Just the number of cards that we bought, we probably spent $40 in cards. And then I was like, Kate, you're never getting a card again. Because we're going to bless the world, right? Yeah, until next year. I'll get her a card. So, secondly, to stand against systemic evils and oppressive forces will always create tension. It will always create tension. Because that means that someone has a vested interest in keeping the status quo. And most often, oppressive systems don't allow voices of oppression to be heard. And so the role of the church is always to speak out for those that have no voices. And so you all are God's megaphone into this creation. And lastly, you are known not by the way you believe, but by the way that you love. And love is not a feeling, love is an action. Everybody say, love is an action. And so there's this great hymn that we're going to sing in the next 6 weeks in all the services. They will know that we are Christians by our love. Everybody know that hymn? They will know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. That is the defining factor of who you are. And it is easy to love your family, well, some of them. It's easy to love the people you like, but it's really hard to follow Jesus' call to love enemy even. And so how do we love together? There's a poem that has been attributed falsely to Mother Teresa because it was found in her house without a name of author. So they believe Mother Teresa had written this poem. Actually, there's a guy by the name of Kent Keith. I found out that he actually lives here. Yeah. He wrote it in 1968. Huh? Even more story. I wish he could come and read it. I would have asked him if I knew who he was. But anyways. Okay, enough. I'm kidding. Is he really? Well, tell him to come to church. Anyways, so Dr. Keith wrote this poem called the Paradoxical Commandments in 1968 as a way of introducing a different way to live. And I hope that it messages to you the radicalness of the gospel that we follow. And maybe let it sit with you as you hear these words. And so the Paradoxical Commandments. People are illogical, unreasonable, and self-centered. Love them anyway. If you do good, people will accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Do good anyway. If you're successful, you will win false friends and some true enemies. Succeed anyway. The good you do today will be forgotten tomorrow. Do good anyway. Honesty and frankness make you vulnerable. Be honest and frank anyway. The biggest men and women with the biggest ideas can be shot down by the smallest men and smallest women with the smallest of minds. Think big anyway. People favor underdogs but follow only the top dogs. Fight for the underdogs anyway. What you spend years building may be destroyed overnight. Build anyway. People really need help, but may attack you if you do try to help them. Help them anyway. And give the world the best you have, and you'll get kicked in the teeth. Give the world the best that you have anyway. This faith is one that calls us into selfless living, that calls us to go into love in a radical way that changes another's life. And though they may hurt us, and though they make fun of us, and though they may paddle away from us on a surfboard, love them anyway. For that is who we are, and that is who God is. And so may we be that kind of people anyway. Amen.